This is Talking Infrastructure, the podcast brought to you by global infrastructure consultancy AECOM. This time, we've taken the podcast on the road. This is the first of two we've recorded with our panel of experts in front of a live audience at the UK's Real Estate, Investment and Infrastructure Forum, more commonly known, of course, as UKREiiF. I'm Toby Sadler. Welcome to Talking Infrastructure. The panel took over the AECOM cafe venue at UKREiiF. The title, Building Places to Last, Placemaking and the New Towns Agenda. At its core, we were discussing what makes a thriving community and not just a housing scheme. Infrastructure-led planning and placemaking first design were front of mind, but also the question of how do we pay for it all? We looked at public-private partnerships and asked how a then, now and next lens can help us learn from and not repeat the lessons of the past. On the panel, we had Patrick Clarke, Masterplanning Lead at AECOM, Angela Barnicle, Director of City Development at Leeds City Council, Rob Chesworth, who's Head of Strategic Land at the Crown Estate, and Cathy Francis, Director for New Towns, Infrastructure and Housing Delivery at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. I started by asking Patrick Clarke to define what the term placemaking means to him.
Yes, thank you, Toby. As I said, I'm Patrick Clarke, Master Planning Lead at AECOM, working on a range of large-scale new communities on brownfield, but predominantly on greenfield sites of between sort of 3.5 and 10,000 homes. And I've sort of learned a fair bit from that experience. And placemaking is absolutely fundamental, in my view. It's a very broad term. It's capable of being defined in different ways in different contexts. But it engages with the social, the economic and the environmental pillars of sustainability. And it also places significant emphasis on working with communities to design with them rather than for them. I think just looking specifically at a new town context, I think it operates at two levels. Firstly, I think there's a macro level. So thinking about the scale of these places, a new town of 10,000 homes is 25,000 people. It's a whole new sort of market town scale of development with all of the land uses and activities that brings. And also often that development is taking place alongside an existing place. So increasing the size of that from 50 to 75,000 people. So at that scale, there's the opportunity to make a real difference to what you might describe as sort of strategic, authority-wide, sub-regional challenges, whether they're around sort of economic development, the revitalisation of town centres, the energy transition, and moving away from car-based living to sustainable public transport and active travel. And then alongside that, I think there's the very important micro side, which is thinking about the grain of places, the character, the identity, the layout of the streets, the open spaces, the landscape, the design of the homes to create places where people will really want to live and feel satisfied in their lives. So I think the challenge for me is, we've got to do both of those challenges, the macro and the micro well, and we've got to do them rapidly at pace.
Perfect. Angela, come to you next. Macro, micro, does that resonate with you in terms of your definition of placemaking?
Yes, in part. And for me, placemaking is all about creating a place where people belong. And belonging is different for different people, isn't it? I'm a geographer by profession and a commercial practice surveyor by training. And we were always taught that there are three elements to really good regeneration and placemaking. First of all, the physical. It has to create environments where people do feel that they do belong and they could get to, and importantly, get out of as well. Secondly, that social regeneration. It's not about displacing a community. It's not about regeneration. It's about making sure that the communities that are here already feel that they can participate in the opportunities that new communities are bringing alongside them. And then thirdly, about that economic. So making sure that our people all have the skills available to them to reach their potential of life. And I think that's what we are looking to create here in Leeds, in the South Bank, which is 10 years in the making. It's probably got another 20 years, if we're really brutally honest, about coming forward, where it's really knitted and ingrained into the city. And it's one of the reasons why we put it forward as an urban new town, so that we could see that acceleration in the next 3 years of 10,000 homes, whilst then looking 2030 beyond about how do we go further and faster beyond that, and along planned infrastructure that's already on a Treasury budget line.
Thank you very much. Yes, since I good context and pressures ahead. Rob, how about yourself?
What listeners of your podcast won't realise is we're all sat there some sort of 90s boy band.
And girl.
We applaud the key change. That's what we're looking for, yeah.
That must sit the I'm a bit stuck. I know that when we talked about this in advance, I was a bit, I sort of a bit indifferent towards placemaking, and that's not to say it's important, such extent it's helpful, but it means a million things to million people. And so I guess I'd say this, I really wish I had a pivot online, but I don't. I think new built housing in the UK has at best a patchy record of just funding to locate. And good places tend to do that well, and they tend to create conditions for people to buy. Generally, Crown Estate wouldn't do stuff in markets that markets can already do. So what we should try and do is this. It's a bit different in the nature of the organisation we are and the conditions we have around our investment horizon and so on. And that's, the housing sector in the UK is desperately in need of a bit of innovation. And so a few things relevant to HK people say. We should stop thinking about new settlements as just housing. Most of our, most of the applicants have in front of me. So most of the people in this room have got responsibility for or experience of delivering new settlements. We've got 60,000 plots in our pipeline, probably 10 to 15 million square feet of employment space. Now, most of these new, in the post-war industrial era, homes gathered around jobs, and we sort of decoupled homes and jobs. The UK housing sector desperately needs more innovation in tenure and product to cater to different people and different communities at different stages of their lives, different economic means. It means more publicly accessible green space and more equitable access to green space. It means any number of the things that the panel have already said. But I think it starts with understanding what local needs are and do your best to respond.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. So, Cathy, we come to you. Introduction, a lot's gone before you. Do you feel that resonates with you, that all of those bits that Rob's picking up on, that's what makes place?
It is all of that. And I think my pithy one-liner, if I was to try and share one, would be build places where you'd like to live yourself. Okay? I remember moving house 2020-21, and I was speaking to Peter Freeman, who obviously is the architect of King's Cross and our chair at Cambridge. And he said, you should feel really happy in your last 500 foot walk to your house. It should really lift your spirits. And I kind of never forgot that. That last jaunt into your road, as you turn, you should feel lifted and you should feel happy. So I think placemaking is about a feeling of safety and belonging and a destination where you want to be. But at the macro level, absolutely, great places are about infrastructure and green and community and safety. And I think we have a long way to go. We have too few examples of that. We have great examples in this country. And I think our New Towns programme, I spotted Kate somewhere, she's behind me, who was on our New Towns task force, really offers us an opportunity to embrace the best of this country's great tradition of house building, but also show how we can think into the future, because it's right. We are 30 years in the making on these new towns. I will be long gone from this role before our new town programme has finished. So I think we should really be thinking long term about all those wider benefits around skills and employment and how we build the next generation of house builders through this programme, how we embrace innovation with MMC. So I think it's a massive opportunity. And I want us to, once we get through the next stage of our consultation, which closed today, I want us to really think creatively together about how we bring alive the community engagement aspect of new towns and how we do it in a really meaningful way, so that it's not just people on the fringe over 60 who have time on their hands that are contributing to consultations, but we're really kind of sparking the imagination of the next generation. And we've got Helen here from Places for People. I know Harlow and Gilston's
large, really large new settlement that's in the planning. It kind of borders where I live. My 3-year-old granddaughter may want to live there. How do we build somewhere that she'll want to live in? So I think huge opportunities, lots of lessons to learn, and we will only do it if we work in partnership.
Yeah, there's a lot to solve there, but I think that where you summed up the last 500 metres towards your house is something we all aspire to, isn't it? But I wonder, Patrick, what you've all described here is a lovely place to live, but square that now with housing targets and type programs and the housing crisis and need to get people somewhere to live. How do you make it all work together?
Well, I get the challenges, but I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I think we can deliver at pace. Historically, if anybody wants a really nice reference example, look at the Well Hall or Progress Estate in Greenwich that was effectively designed over a weekend during the start of the First World War and was designated as a conservation area in the early 70s. Nicholas Pesner described it as a tour de force in picturesque design. So there's a very particular timeline and model of delivery, but it shows that quality design and great placemaking can be delivered at pace if you have the right people in the room. And I think in a different way, we've done that recently at Brooklee, where we developed the outline planning application and had that consented within 16 months. We did that by front-loading it with technical evidence and design thinking. So the placemaking didn't come along at the end. It was right in mid-Sussex. Yes, a scheme of 3,500 homes for Homes England. So the placemaking was embedded from the start with strategic design principles that made commitments to design outcomes, and then a design guide that was submitted for approval with the outline application so that it had teeth, and then a street design and an adoption manual that added further layers of detail. So in that case, we worked progressively through the design agenda, nailing what we could at the right times, so that the design thinking was embedded, but it was working at pace alongside all of the technical work, and that enabled the scheme to move forward into delivery very rapidly compared to most large-scale schemes.
Okay. Angela, there's been a lot of work done in Leeds City Centre over the last 10, 20 years. Do you feel the approach is evolving because of the sort of, I guess, the aspirations you guys have spoken about in terms of placemaking? Do you find you're compromised? What's the Leeds approach at the moment?
So I think Leeds has been on a journey. Well, we're a city that this year will have our 400th charter, so we've constantly been evolving. So I don't think it's about the last 10 years. It's been about how do we... it's just worth saying that spatially Leeds is massive. It's 5 times that of Manchester City Council's boundary, twice that of Birmingham's. In the local plan, we've got 61 local centres, 62 if you include the city centre. So we see ourselves as a number of towns and villages, and there are, communities in Leeds who still don't feel that they're in Leeds because of, local government reform in 1974 or, when we lost a 2-tier in 86. And I think you've got to really respect those villages and those towns that make up cities and metropolitan districts and treat them just with as much care as you do the city centre. And again, to come back to right where you're sat now, whilst we in this room call it the South Bank, a lot of the communities who live here call it Hunslet or call it Holbeck or call it Bermontoffs, because that has been the communities from the very start. And I think what we've tried to do in the last 10 years when we worked with Arup and Gell about the South Bank Master Plan is reflect those neighbourhoods and talk about restitching them back into the city centre, both economically and physically as well. And if you get the opportunity to step just like 200 metres further down the river here and east towards the Climate Innovation District and Situ, I think that's where you're going to see a really great next generation neighbourhood that has been, 8, 9, 10 years in the making. They make their homes on site. Their factory is there. The first person they employed was the gardener to make sure that as the homes came forward, they were established. That point about that last 500 metres shouldn't come 5 years after you've occupied your house. So how do you make sure that the communities are ready to be lived in on day one? And one of the really innovative things that they did, and sometimes it's just doing the basics really well, is they put in a footbridge between the north and the south bank of the river. And that footbridge did three things. Not only did it knit their community together, it carried the district heating pipe from the energy to waste centre that we've got down on the Aire Valley. It also meant that the communities in Bermontoffs had 17 less roads to cross when they were accessing the further education facilities and the high school that have developed here in the South Bank. And I think that's what we've really tried to do, is respect the communities that are already there, that do not want to be renamed, but do want to have that aspiration and do want to have that access into a growing city.
Okay, thank you. Robin, when we talk about history there, the Crown Estate's got a fair bit of history. Does that influence your decision-making in terms of you're a long-term landowner, you can make decisions for the long-term future, or do you still feel the short-term pressures?
Yeah, I think being a patient investor is one of our biggest advantages, but it doesn't mean that sort of economic gravity doesn't apply to us either. And so for sure, it allows us to think about risk and partnership in a slightly different way and stuff, but equally, a lot of the challenges we're facing are immediate. And so innovation cycles can be really short if you want them to be short. Not everything has to be long-term, I guess is the point I'm saying. And so it affects how we think about, I know, you need, much as it's helpful to be a long-term investor, you need political alignment, you need community will, and in many cases, those timescales will be determined for you, right? So we have a sort of artificial cliff edge, which is the end of the parliamentary term. We have some electoral timescales around our big schemes where we know we've got political alignment or we won't have. And so whilst it's helpful for us to be able to invest through cycles and many of the asset classes that we operate in, we're also governed by the same issues around basic alignment with communities and politics that most people are.
Great stuff. Cathy, I wonder, just to touch on, you mentioned it before, the New Towns Task Force recommendations now being accepted by government, also placemaking for priority in locations and so on. How is that thinking sort of translating to the delivery on the ground, the principles that will ultimately build these places that people will call home?
Just before I come to that, I just want to kind of echo the point about Situ, which if there's anybody here who hasn't been to Situ, it's just the most amazing development. And actually the MD and his partner, they live there. So they have passed my test. Would you live there? They actually do. I just had to say that. But in terms of the new towns and the principles, the consultation on new towns closed today. So the next stage is for us to consider what has been, what the consultation tells us, individually and at a macro level. Then we move forward to make recommendations to ministers. They make decisions. And at some point post the work that we're doing around the strategic environmental assessment and the HABS regs, ministers will announce which are the towns that will be formally adopted onto the programme. Now, in the meantime, and it's really important to say this, in the meantime, we are working with all of the new towns. And even those that aren't formally adopted onto the programme will be very important strategic sites for us. And so we are already in the background talking to, Leeds. My team are working with colleagues in Leeds constantly and all the other sites to understand what the kind of deal on both sides of the house is. So in terms of our placemaking principles, asking individual locations, how are you going to manifest them? Because, we've got some high level principles. The devil is in the detail. How do you apply those to Leeds, which is an urban centre, and sites that are non-contiguous across quite a broad area, versus somewhere like Tempsford, which is not brownfield and will be kind of coterminous. So how do you give rise to those principles? That's part of the deal in terms of the delivery partner. As government, we want to bring the whole of government to the party. We want to recognise and respond to what the public repeatedly tell us, that the infrastructure must come first. And that's why the conversations that we're having with DFT, with DEFRA, DFE and DH are so important through this next stage as we actually start thinking about delivery, both tactically in the short term, and we've made some commitments around delivery in this Parliament, whilst recognising that some of the infrastructure asks are going to be long term and are going to come over a number of parliaments.
Patrick, I wonder, taking all of that in, there's a lot of things to consider when you're advising, when you're looking at new developments. I've been thinking, of obviously we've got Wellbourne Garden Village in Hampshire, Brooklyn in West Sussex as kind of examples. How did you solve these problems in those developments, and other lessons from those that we can now look at and think, you know what, we can use this in the future too?
Yeah, I think looking at things holistically is really important. So I think as a general principle, front-loading the process with technical evidence, with stakeholder engagement, and drawing all of that together so that you can do a proper synthesis of all of the issues at the macro and the sort of the micro levels, and generate a series of options that address, the key strategic challenges as well as the sort of the placemaking alternatives, and then be able to evaluate them against, a broadly based framework that includes viability and cost assessment, because our recently published cost model indicates that the cost of the infrastructure going alongside new community projects is of the order of £67,000 per home. That varies quite significantly between sites. And that's probably more in a greenfield type context. But it's a sizable cost, and clearly you've got to be thinking very carefully from the outset about what is the infrastructure delivery strategy for the site, and what can be brought in through partnership working beyond the red line of the site itself, to think about upgrading existing infrastructure and getting synergies between existing communities and the new communities. So you've got a sort of what you might call a whole place approach, rather than something that's confined to within the red lines of the new town itself.
Makes a lot of sense. I wonder, as we're looking forward, Angela, whether there are lessons of the past you think we should be remembering as we start making our plans for the next few decades?
Well, we should always learn from our past, shouldn't we? And I think the one thing that I worry about at the moment is the provision of school places. And for example, in Leeds, we've actually got a decline in birth rate at the minute. It's not unusual. These are cyclical things. And that means that when you look at Leeds as a district, and again, I've already said how big it is, we've probably got capacity in our primary school system. But actually, the capacity is not matching up to the demand. And if you want to create places like here, where you are creating multi-generational places for people to stay and to bring up a family, then we need a primary school. And we're looking at innovative ways of how we can do that within a system that says, actually, at the top level, you've got capacity. So I think that's the one killer thing that we need to work through over the next 12 months. And it relates back to, how do you deliver that infrastructure that communities need at the time that the community need it? And it's the same with GP practices, etc. And my old chief executive would say that probably 70% of his time that he spent in full council was debating housing and planning matters. And it was always relating back to, can I get my children into the local school, and can I get into the nearest GP? And I think that's one thing that I would really urge us all to think really hard about, certainly with a new shift, from the NHS into neighbourhood health. How do you get those investments really early on?
A lot of that comes out of trust, I suppose, in the system and the people doing the developing. Rob, does that align with your priorities, I suppose, when you're looking to greenlight things?
I want to just reflect a bit on the last two comments, to be slightly contentious. Cathy might hit me. 1.5 million homes are not getting built if infrastructure is between 60 and 80 grand a plot. Just not, are they? And so but they don't need to be. It doesn't need to be. And so to get to 1.5 million homes, all boats need to rise. So PLCs need to keep doing their thing. Regional builders need to do their thing. We need a resurgence of SMEs. We've got 40% fewer SMEs than we had in the 70s. RPs need to be better capitalised. The state needs to build some homes. Then we might get close. And then we need to look to the continent in Europe for a multitude of examples of more multi-tenure delivery, of better regional governance structures, of more, and then we look to the States, for example, Texas, for infrastructure funding innovation. There are loads of things we can learn. I'll give you a couple of examples. We're doing a couple of really small pilot projects, 50 and 75 homes respectively, where we're looking at the relationship between two things. One is environmental sustainability occupancy costs. So can you drive down bills through environmental sustainability measures? And the other one is some tenure-based innovation. So a discounted market rental product tied to local median incomes. And I suppose I always thought that innovation was like designing new widgets or something, right? But in this case, it's just like a bit of ingenuity and a bit of thoughtfulness. And like any one of us could do that. Neither of those things are so decretive to viability that with a fair wind, we couldn't do a bit more of it. And in both cases, we learn from stuff that had been done in Europe. This isn't stuff we've come up with ourselves. It's been done before. And so I agree with everything Patrick said about principles. Of course I do. But I think in order to get to the level of ambition, like a national mission that we've set ourselves, we do need to think more innovatively about delivery, about all the things I've just mentioned.
So, Cathy, the first question, are you going to hit Rob? And secondly...
I think I've recovered it.
Yeah, nice recovery.
Yeah, so does that resonate with you? Do we need to make a change? Do things need to be shaken up?
So, look, I remember when I worked on youth crime policy, many years ago, and I had a really frustrated minister who was like banging the table, literally saying, what are we going to do to solve youth crime? You need to tell me what the one thing is we need to do. And I had to take a deep breath and I had to say, Minister, there isn't a silver bullet. And the same with housing, right? There are 29 things that we need to do. And I think there is something about how we work in concert at those 29 things, private, public, community, and still more for us to do in government. The issue around schools is, I hear that, and we need to be better in HMG in having those conversations that are beyond the spreadsheet. Because actually, if you look at the spreadsheet, I'm sure you've got enough school places. What's the problem? But actually, we need them here and we need them at this point in time. So how we have those conversations when everyone is pressing really hard on their kind of day-to-day kind of delivery priorities in each department. And I think new towns housing is about how do you get a kind of horizontal slice of government working on this mission. And I like the word mission. We seem to have lost that. We were very much into missions 2 years ago, but I think it is a national mission. And actually, at its heart is getting away from the position where we've got 170,000 children in temporary accommodation. I mean, that is at its heart. We are such a rich country that just children not having somewhere to call home we've just got to get past that. And we've got to, I think having the 1.5 million target is galvanizing and we've got to keep our eye on the prize. But yeah, we've got the new homes accelerator in the department. It comes under my team and my job share partners team. Now, that was set up to kind of unlock development, to kind of take some of the friction out of house building on particular sites. And I was with a developer last week who was really grateful for the support that we'd given them on a particular site, and then happened to mention two others. And I said, but why don't we know about these other problems? And I think my message to people here who are at the coalface doing the hard stuff of delivery is be more angry, be more, harass us, call us, say, I must have an answer to this. I must have this government department around the table because it is a national emergency. You can't be too annoying, trust me. And there is an example of somebody I met 2 years ago who literally took me up at my word, and we have managed to lift the safeguarding on a site from DFT and to put in place some other flexibilities that they need to get that site going. I won't mention him, but he was bloody annoying, right? And I think this isn't the time to be tentative. Right, if you've got a site and you can deliver, particularly if you can deliver in this parliament, let's go.
Okay, Patrick, are you prepared to join the revolution? We're storming the battlements this afternoon. So, you ready?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the mission emergency are appropriate terms. We've been talking about the housing supply being in shortage since the Barker Review in the early 2000s. And we're in 2026 and it's not getting better quickly. So we need to step up again. I think equally we should acknowledge the progress that we have made. Going back 15 years ago, large-scale housing projects were the least popular form of development in the country, probably. And the larger they were, the more unpopular they were. Last year, the task force asked for locations that could accommodate 10,000 homes or more. And there were reportedly more than 100 locations put forward, largely by local authorities. So that says to me that there's no shortage of ambition to lead at the local level to deliver homes and infrastructure. And I think the reason for that change in attitude is the recognition that if you plan at a bigger scale, you can identify the infrastructure that's needed, you can identify the macro challenges that I alluded to at the start and plan positively to deliver them, and you can capture a lot of the infrastructure cost requirement from the uplifted land value. So that, we've made significant progress, but we now need to build on that platform, really urgently.
Angela, do you think we talked about trust before, we've talked about the need of the community. Do you think the community's got enough of a voice and that they're invested enough in this and they feel that their voice is being heard?
I think community voice comes through in lots of different ways, and whatever else we need to do to get it even louder, we absolutely must. And if I think about some of the things that we've done here, certainly with our children and young people, so we've got a children's Lord Mayor who has his own manifesto and actually convenes a youth group around that. We work with a number of providers, including the Ahead Partnership, who we will work with, who will do a bespoke engagement program, which not only will upskill the young people, but will hear their views. So we did it for Morley Town Deal. So Morley got awarded a Town Deal status, about just short of £24 million. And we, through Ahead, we were able to reach 7,000 young voices in a way that we couldn't have done it through the lens of the City Council. And they did it in a very tailored package. And we heard so much content about what those citizens of the future wanted now for their community. And again, we've used people like, if you get a chance on your way in, go visit Emma Behrman at the Playbox. It's the big pink Playbox on your way in. And what she does is a lot of consultation and engagement through play. Play being something that every generation needs. And if you design playful places, they're the most engaging places as well. And we work with Emma to get that community voice through again.
Rob, I wonder whether you feel there's more needs to be done to close that gap between sort of, I guess, public perception and lived experience, whether we're making enough of headway in that area.
I think I'm going to struggle to build on the last answer, to be honest. I think there's a lot to be said for, like, if you talk about doing engagement, you have to really mean it, and it's time intensive, it can be resource intensive, and it can be hard, but it should be worth it. It should be worth it to the people bringing forward the development, and it should be worth it to the community for which that development serves. I guess I can give some examples. And by the way, I think part of doing good engagement is trying stuff that doesn't work, because otherwise, how do you know? And so, we've tried a bunch of stuff that hasn't been successful, but small scheme. We did some stuff with the Sortition Foundation, who do demographically representative sampling. We did a youth panel. We did a future renters panel. We did a co-housing panel. And we've ended up with a bunch of rich content in this master plan that, even with all the best intent in the world, we'd just never have known. You'd have been speculating. Now, to an extent, some of that, when you get to master plan scale, or you get to a bigger scale, some of that stuff you learn starts to push up against policies, and you end up with but all those things are solvable, right? I think the central challenge for good engagement is time and cash flows, to be honest. Like, there were so many pressures on viability that, I think a lot of developers are better intentioned than people probably realise. It just the constraining factor is infrastructure bill 106, etc., and like creeping pressure on IRR. And that's not to say, by the way, that's not an excuse. It's just an economic reality. But with enough forethought, you can do great engagement, and I think products are all the richer and all the better for it.
Thank you. Cathy, that idea of experimentation and trying things out, harder when you get to the big government departments, not so nimble. Do you see that's an option, though, inspiration from that idea?
Yeah, but I think, government departments can learn a lot through place. And I think how government departments kind of lean into new towns and big strategic sites and use it as an opportunity to test how they are delivering their services, what the kind of future public service network might look like, how we digital should make some of this easier. It should make engagement easier and make it easier to reach. Let's go on TikTok and do it. That's the extent of my knowledge. I'm not going to say anything. That's my line. That's it. But I don't have a TikTok account. But my point is, there are ways, and there are people, and there are influencers who can help us reach parts of the community that we have no hope of reaching in Whitehall, and you do it through place, you do it through these sites, and so we just need to use lots of different media and lots of different voices to help us understand. And I think, look, if you never fail, you've never tried, right? So I think this is great, Rob, that you've got that kind of rich analysis of what's worked, and presumably some of it you'll try again, some of it in a different way.
Thank you. Just to warn everybody, the Q&A is coming quite soon, so this is a chance to be brave, think creatively, and interrogate our esteemed panel. So get thinking. A couple of other thoughts from you guys before we get to that. Patrick, I know when we spoke about this before, you were looking at developments in not just 10, 20, 30 years. You were saying this needs to have like a 100-year legacy. How do you make sure that what we're building now is still valuable and is still a place that people want to call home in 100 years?
Well, it has to be, because housing's such a long-term use. It's an end use. It's not like an office development or a retail park or anything else that might have an investment life of 25 years. And if it's not working after that, you can knock it down and replace it with something else. Housing passes to individual owners, to housing associations, and becomes their responsibility to look after. So it needs to be designed really well with that type of life in mind. But I think on Wellbourne, we were asked to create a legacy master plan for the landowner who wanted to create a legacy for South Hampshire. So looking at places that had stood the test of time and met the housing needs and aspirations of successive generations was really important to us. And after a sort of fairly extensive road trip, one of the places that really stood out to us and met the sort of, Cathy, your point around the last 500 metres, the micro level, was Brentham Garden Suburb in Ealing, which was built by the Ealing Tenants Association back in the early 1900s. And is, a relatively simple layout by Raymond Unwin, very, very good sort of architecture and landscape structure. But the thing that really stood out to me about that was the way the landscape has matured over time. So that actually it looks smarter as a place to live today than it did 100 years ago. And that really struck a chord with the Wellbourne team and client. Well, here, how do we create a place that is actually going to improve and mature with age? And the landscape structure is a really fundamental component of that in my view.
I wonder, does that feed into the Leeds vision? Because they're obviously very different places to city centre Leeds, but is the kernel of that thinking what you're thinking too?
I mean, we need resilient places, don't we? In Leeds, we're probably building 80% of our housing supply on brownfield land. And what we really want to make sure is that we're not having to build it again in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We want to build places that actually stand that test of 100, 150 years. In a world where climate resilience adaptation is changing faster than probably we're keeping up with. And one of the things that we did in Leeds after the Boxing Day floods of 2015, we had a storm Eva descended on us on Boxing Day, and we had, if it hadn't have been Boxing Day, I'm pretty sure we would have seen loss of life in the city because it was that catastrophic. It was a 1 in 200 year event, and we were partway through a flood alleviation scheme, and we lobbied quite hard. I think we became that body that gets quite annoying, Cathy, where our leader and our MPs went in to see the minister to say, Leeds needs this now. And we ended up taking delegated powers from the Environment Agency. We're only one of two places where we directly delivered a flood alleviation scheme along the River Aire, working on a total catchment approach right up from Malham, which is the source of the Aire itself, working with landowners, working with a community interest company that does natural flood management, right through to some very hard infrastructure such as removable weirs. Removable. You know what I'm talking about?
Raisable.
Raisable,
right?
not removable. And through that, we gave the confidence to deliver in the South Bank itself, because obviously it's flood protection here now. It's 1 in 200 years of event.
Rob, what have you, in that you've expressed some concerns about the way things are at the moment, can I ask, do you feel optimistic about where we are?
I sort of felt much more optimistic at the turn of the year than I do now. I think the sort of the prevailing geopolitical and macroeconomic context has made a series of things that were hard a little bit harder. I guess in some cases quite a lot harder. But I do feel, for whatever sort of, whatever your political views, I think this government has published an awful lot of positive things on planning reform. So it has created a series of the sort of prevailing conditions or prevailing policy environment is very positive. And I think you've got to sort of look around this room. You've got a willing and captive audience. You've got investors, developers, local authorities, investors, everybody keen to make progress. I just think we need some of the international stuff to calm down, I think, because viability was already tough before construction cost inflation, before people started worrying about rates rises. Most people had priced into rate cuts, I think. So I think the sort of prevailing economic context is really difficult. People are going to struggle to make immediate decisions on stuff that they might have felt more optimistic about in February. But, with a fair wind, hopefully those things pass. Am I optimistic in the medium to longer term? I think you've got to be.
Fair enough. Cathy, I wonder, just a quick thought for you, just on how you're looking at the volatility, because obviously you can't control it, but you need to be able to work with it. What's in your mind at the moment?
So look, we're constantly looking at what more can we do within the existing policy framework and beyond to address the world as we see it now, rather than as we would wish it to be. And I think, we've got the National Housing Bank, we've got the significant infrastructure funds. The question is, are we getting the kind of cocktail of interventions right across planning and funding in terms of how we bring partners together, whether it's international investors, local authorities, combined authorities, innovative finance, all of that. So I think it puts a premium on how we come together to figure out what is needed now and in the long term in a place, and how we use the resources that we have, like I said, through the bank, through grants, through other sources of income. And if we need to go further in a policy perspective, that can make a difference in a short while. This isn't the moment to think, okay, the response to the problem is legislation, because that's not going to help us in the short term. So, are we doing enough to bridge the viability gap is a very live conversation that we're having in government. And, we're open to responses and suggestions of how we can work together to get over what I hope is a relatively short period of downward pressure on all of those KPIs that were beginning to move up in January and February. And I hope we can kind of get back to that. But the job's not done. I think the policy environment is much more positive in terms of what we're trying to do. But we're not complacent, and we know we might need other interventions in the short term.
We'll be back next time with our second episode from UKREiiF, exploring how to get Northern Powerhouse Rail to construction. But for now, if you enjoyed this podcast, then please like, subscribe, leave a review, tell your friends and colleagues, and of course, feel free to plug it on social media. Until next time, thank you very much and goodbye.